In this lecture, we'll reach the end of the civilizing process, the dawn of nationalism. We'll look at the Grimms as well as other members of the nation-building project through the collection of folktales and the rewriting of national history through epics and the genre of literature that can be characterized as fairy tales for adults. The literary fairy tale that began with the Olney's Island of Happiness became even more popular as the utility of shaping, forming national character attracted both young and adult readers, and found its apex really in the eerie psychological unease of dreams in E.T.A. Hoffmann, as well as in the transubstantial style of Jose Anderson, where religion and the spirit become the ideals of another world that was both challenged and longed for. So when you look at a painting like Caspar David Friedrich's The Wanderer Above the Fog, you have to think about, like, what is the relationship that's presented there to the viewer? The individual is conquering nature atop the mountain, alone, away from society, but dressed in a suit, as if he were attending a social function. It's the fantasy of the romantic. This view is fuzzy, the fog, the haze, indicates that the vision of the romantic is not to dissect, investigate things under the magnifying glass, but to reject reason for what is the unknown, the dreamlike, the uncertain psychological depth of the world. A world that has to be imagined. This is the conquest of nature, but also the conquest of oneself, and the image of the self-made man facing away from us allows affluent males from the time who might have gazed upon the image to imagine themselves there in his stead. These are all the essential traits of Romanticism, which is at its heart a rejection of enlightenment, the movement of reason, rationalism, that all can be understood. But more importantly, it is perceived as the outside force that has been brought upon Germany by Napoleon, and really that this reason is a foreign influence. So part of the rejection of the rational was the adoption of looking upon the darker side of human nature, which was so evident and yet often overlooked or brushed aside by those of the Enlightenment thinkers. The darker side of history was often carried by the folk, so that a literature that helped address their plight, their beliefs, needed to represent their exploitation and explore the ways in which they have had to deal with the reality of death, illness, and disease. This darker nature of humanity became popular as national identity formed in opposition to the Enlightenment and as part of its influence on the interpretation and role of the church being challenged by scientific knowledge. It provided space for the imagined past that was full of demons, elves, and spirits. And this is, in part, one of the reasons why witch hunts occurred in the early modern period and not in the medieval period, as many assume. It was really this challenge to the dominant system of power of the Catholic Church, in some places the Protestant Church, which was also a challenge, and also alongside of all that, the heresy that was considered to be science. And this transformed into a new interest in folklore and pre-Christian spirit world to seek a simpler time, a more Germanic historical connection, and shed some of the more oppressive and unfair features that the civilizing process had brought with it. So here, if you look at The Elf King, which is written by Goethe, there's this apparition, this ghost, and we see in his poem that was later keyed to song by Franz Schubert, there are really two interpretations of the story in the poem itself. One that represents a fever dream, the scientific observation of what is happening, juxtaposed against the irrational visions of the child of the Elf King coming to steal away his soul. And really, so with that, you get the romantic subjective interpretation of what is happening by the child against that of the father who's attempting to comfort the child and himself explain what's happening through his observation, that scientific explanation. So, but in the end, we're really left not really knowing which interpretation to give greater weight, as they both seemingly are equally valid in the experiences of the two. The Elf King eventually lures or seduces the son, just like the wolf does Little Red, and tempts him with pleasures without really telling him that he's being lured to his death. Now, moving on to then the Grimm brothers' role in this, we'll focus on just two of those brothers, that's Jakob and Wilhelm, and the pleasant upper middle class childhood that they grew up in Steinau, where they often would play in the woods, and with their parents, Philip and Dorothea, sort of heading that household. Their father worked for the local ruler, and he was able to afford a waitstaff so that they enjoyed a rather easy life until the year that Jakob turned 11. In that year, his father took ill and just in a few weeks passed. Within 1 week of his death, the grieving family was ordered to move out of their house, and Jakob was now the man of the family. The family moved to Kassel, where Dorothea's father and sister lived, and where her sister was a lady-in-waiting for William I, who was the Elector of Hesse. And then the two brothers attended school there, and this is where they also met the Wild sisters, who lived directly across from them on their street. And the brothers would eventually attend the University of Marburg and were very industrious, as they did not take the opportunity for granted. They caught the attention of Friedrich von Savigny, who saw how Jakob was interested in medieval literature and eventually asked him to come with him to Paris as a research assistant. At the time, Jakob's mom was ill and she relied on him, but the opportunity was simply too tempting, and so he bid her adieu. It was through Savigny that the brothers were introduced to Johann Gottfried von Herder's ideas about Volkspoesie, that language formed the character of German identity. And this idea spurred the collecting of folk songs by Clemens Brentano and Achim von Arnim, who published Das Knaben Wunderhorn in 1805, and who had as a side project the collection of folk tales, which then they gave to the Grimm brothers. So whenever they met, they didn't seem to value these folk tales that Jakob and Wilhelm were collecting all that much. And then also Jakob didn't appreciate the way that Brentano and Arnim were adapting this folk material more with their own artistic flair. It was also during this period that Jerome Bonaparte, the brother of Napoleon, was installed as the new king of Westphalia, and Jakob then became his librarian. So Wilhelm, on the other hand, his health had deteriorated, and he either assisted in the library, but he often also had to take to spas to recover. And the image that they had of the folk was mostly an imagined construct. They had not really spent all that much time out there collecting stories. Instead, they relied rather heavily on a couple of families, the Hasenpflug and Wild sisters. And then there was a few other contexts that had brought the stories to them for them to edit. They edited these stories often in a way that added violence, they censored the sexuality, and became more formal and stylized over the course of their many revisions, especially after the initial success of their first publication. These are not servants, they're not from the lower class, they're not folk, these are upper middle class women who probably read these stories and are retelling them, and that's where they're getting this idea of the folk. The tales would take shape to their final form over 50 years of editing and the publication of 7 different editions. Some of the tales were excluded because of their foreign nature, such as Puss in Boots and Bluebeard. And the first edition was published in a limited count of 600 exemplar, and they contained 86 stories in 1812, with the second volume following thereafter in 1814, 1815, that brought the tale count to 156. So the next edition was thoroughly expanded. One of the most prolific contributors to that edition was Dortchen Wild, the youngest Wild sister from across the street, whom Wilhelm would later marry. And then all 3 of them would live together into their old age, where actually Dortchen would mother Jakob a bit. She kind of like took over that role and helped Dorothea, their actual mother, earlier on in their childhood. There's also a children's edition that was published with a few select stories and illustrations in 1825, but by 1857, the tales had expanded to include 210 tales and translated into 160 different languages. It was also that year that public schools were established in Prussia, and the Grimm stories were to be included as part of their curriculum.